and the children of Israel went out with boldness. So the Egyptians pursued them, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen and his army, and overtook them camping by the sea beside Pi-hahiroth, before Baal-zephon. And when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. So they were very afraid, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Then they said to Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. And Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. You may be seated. And the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward, but lift up your rod, and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. And the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. And I indeed will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they shall follow them. So I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, his chariots and his horsemen. Then the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gained honor for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. And the angel of God who went before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud went from before them and stood behind them. So it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. Thus it was a cloud and darkness to the one, and it gave light by night to the other, so that the one did not come near the other all that night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on the dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on their right and on their left. And the Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. Now it came to pass in the morning watch that the Lord looked down upon the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud, and he troubled the army of the Egyptians. And he took off the chariot wheels, so that they drove them with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, let us flee from the face of the Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians, on their chariots, and on their horsemen. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and when the morning appeared, the sea returned to its full depth, while the Egyptians were fleeing into it. So the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. Then the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all the army of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. Not so much as one of them remained. But the children of Israel had walked on dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. So the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Thus Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt. So the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses. Quite the story. They made a movie about it. Maybe you heard. So last week, I actually dealt into part of what was in this reading today, but it was important that we look at it. And that is that the children of Israel had left. They'd been driven out by their neighbors. Their neighbors had given them all kinds of stuff to take with them. And so they actually, in a sense, looted their neighbors, but it was voluntary. And then somehow along the line, God did something and let Pharaoh become himself, and the people started thinking, what did we do? We let all these people go who worked so hard for us. We got to go get them back. And we read that Pharaoh basically got his whole army together, his chariots, his horses, his whole army, and chased them. And because the people, even though they had seen all the plagues, had still this mentality that they remember what Pharaoh used to do. They knew what Pharaoh's armies could do. They were not still inclined to think in terms of what God could do for them. That they became afraid. And When they became afraid, they said stupid things. In fact, typically when people are afraid, that's when they say and do stupid things. You know, you see these stories about some criminal, and because he's afraid of what might happen, he might be intercepted for something like a minor traffic ticket. And the minute that happens, he does stupid things, because instead of just going ahead and letting the policeman, you know, tell him you're going too fast or whatever, he does some stupid thing, gets himself in trouble. It's not always that deep and dark of a thing. I remember when I was 5, my 6-year-old cousin and I decided to run away from home because our babysitter, his older sister, was being mean to us, so we packed all our underwear in brown paper bags and took off with a fishing pole to a creek we knew. And since we didn't catch any fish right away, we decided we needed to walk out of the woods and go to the country store. And as we walked out of the woods, my grandmother just happened to be driving by. She stopped to give us a ride, and we confessed everything to her. But people do and say stupid things when they're afraid. We were afraid that, oh, we've been caught, so you tell everything. But it showed that they still had more of a sense of what Pharaoh could do than God could do, because Pharaoh was very real to them. He'd been troubling their lives their whole lives, either he or his predecessor. In spite of all the plagues and everything that happened, they didn't know what was going on. Moses would tell them, but it wasn't making any sense to them. This stuff that was happening, they could see that Moses was doing this thing that caused the Egyptians to be all upset, and especially got upset with them. But it's not like they had any great love for God. They were still idolaters for the most part. And so when they see Pharaoh coming, they make this statement: were there no graves in Egypt? It would have been better for us to serve Pharaoh, serve the Egyptians, than to die in the wilderness. Even though Moses had repeatedly told them that the Lord had said, Pharaoh needs to let us go that we may serve the Lord. They had no concept of what serving the Lord meant. They knew that serving Pharaoh meant going out there every morning early and making bricks and helping build pyramids and all kinds of other stuff. They had no clue what serving the Lord meant. What were they supposed to do for him out in the wilderness? They didn't know. Moses knew that it had something to do with offering sacrifices to the Lord, but beyond that, I don't think Moses knew. So they complain. And then God does something. He tells Moses that, tell the people that they're going to see God's salvation. And then he says to them, you're going to see God's salvation today. He says, stand back, watch what God's going to do. And then he says, and hold your peace. That's difficult for us. It's so difficult for us to just hold our peace, to just see what God is going to do. Because somehow, when God's at work, we want to get involved in the wrong way. It makes me think of this. Whenever you go to tie a shoe and there's a dog around, the dog thinks he needs to help you tie your shoe. Have you ever noticed that? They come right over and they're right there and it's like, get out of the way. I'm not tying my shoe. I don't need your help. And sometimes God wants, but on the other hand, God does want us to do something. He said, stand back and watch. But then, he had the Israelites go through the sea. He said, on dry land. Don't you think for a minute that most of them were scared out of their minds as to what they were doing? Wouldn't you be scared out of your mind? There's a wind blowing so strong that the waters tend to part. Now, I personally think that God was doing something else. He said he divided the waters, because normally, if the wind is blowing, it's going to heap it up that way, but instead it parted them. So God was doing something which doesn't fit modern, Newtonian physics or fluid dynamics or anything else. But what's plain is he let the wind blow for a long time to make it dry land. Now, I know that a good, stiff, dry breeze can dry land out pretty quick. Because, we've all seen it happen. It's like, man, this ground is never going to dry out. It's saturated, and then 2 days later it's dry. So God did that. So he used the east wind as part of it. They had to go through it. But notice what else God did for them is like, get a clue, people. That angel, the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire and the cloud cover that they've been given changed all around so that there was a thick cloud between Pharaoh's army and them, so that Pharaoh couldn't see to get through. And then there was light on the other side so they could see to cross the ocean or the dry land between the water at night. I think about how God did this at the birthing of the nation of Israel. And then I think about the stories I've read from the Revolutionary War. How when George Washington's troops were on, I forget which island, but I forget if it was Manhattan or which island it was out there in New York Harbor, that the troops were coming around. The small continental army was completely overtaken and surrounded by the British soldiers. They had no prayer of a chance, and then God caused a wind to go that kept the ships from coming around the bend, and he caused an incredible fog to develop right between the two armies so that the Americans could get out and get rescued by small fleets of boats coming to help them when the other boats couldn't make it, and it kept Washington acknowledged that this was God's doing. God knows how to use the weather, and throughout the rest of the stories of the Old Testament, you will see how God has used the weather to impact the fate of nations. But anyhow, God does this for them. He just sets it all up. And you can see that God has a purpose, because what he does now, and this is what's really interesting, God could have slain them in the wilderness. He could have seen that, but he wants the nation of Israel to see what happens. They all get through. How long that channel is, we don't know. We don't even know where on the Red Sea it took place. I'll be talking about that in a minute, though. They get through on dry land. All the chariots start coming. I said, God fought for them. This is funny. Said he started taking the wheels off. I don't know how he took the wheels off, but it wasn't, poor maintenance. Just the wheels started coming off. And we have an idea of what life is like when the wheels start coming off. Not everybody's had the experience I've had. I mentioned last week about when I used to commute into work in Waltham, and it was quite a journey, a 4-lane highway, and I was all the way, I'll just fill out a little bit more, I was all the way in the fast lane when all of a sudden the car started doing this, so I cut across all the traffic, and just as I got his breakdown lane, the car slammed to the ground because the wheel came off. That was scary. Life gets scary when the wheels come off, doesn't it? It really does. And most people have had the experience of the wheels coming off. And the Egyptians, seeing the wheels coming off, said, we need to flee. We need to go back the other way because God's fighting for them and against us. But in the process of them trying to go back because of that, and the cloud back there, they all wound up being compressed in that area. The whole army was in that place. So, by the way, when you see the pictures like, the Ten Commandments, that story, and it seems so close, whatever part that was of the Red Sea, that had to be a pretty wide thing. That had to be wide to get 2 million people plus cattle through there in one evening. It's a pretty wide thing, and then Pharaoh's whole army. Then God told Moses, raise your hand, and all the waters comes in, and everybody gets drowned, and they get to see it. The people of Israel get to see it. Everything they feared is gone. He took away everything they feared. Now, we'll soon find out that they start fearing other things. You see, people in many ways aren't much different than the animals. One of the most beautiful of God's creatures is the horse. I love horses. I think they're wonderful. They are the most fear-controlled creature you can imagine. They have great hearing in their eyes, and they'll bolt at anything. They're fear. And God told Adam, that the fear of us would be on all the animals. But unfortunately, the fear of us is also upon us. I was glad to see this past week that Idi Amin finally has met his maker. What the people of Zimbabwe suffered because they were too afraid of what he would do to them to get rid of that man. That man was pure evil. But God finally took him. But because of fear, how many things do people do in their daily lives because they fear what other people can and might do to them? When I think about the psalmist said, what can man do to us? And Jesus said, don't be afraid of those who can only kill you. Be afraid of the one who can, after he's killed you, can throw both body and soul into hell, meaning God. And the point is, if we fear God, we have a lot fewer other fears, because we recognize that he's in charge, and if we fear him, he'll give us wisdom. Now, this is a story, and up until now, in spite of all the deliverances from plagues and everything else, the nation of Israel just kind of watches it happen. After the part of the story we just read, we will read that they had a blowout celebration. They had a big celebration. But it's interesting that they didn't have as their annual celebration the crossing of the Red Sea. That was never celebrated annually. It's the Passover. The Passover is the time when they were really declared to be separate and different, but it wasn't until the crossing of the Red Sea that they actually experienced it. I'd like to think about just our nation's history for a minute. Does anybody have a clue when the Revolutionary War started? It was in 1775. Shot heard around the world, I believe. When the hostilities began. Anybody know when it ended? Not for another 7 years. Do we celebrate the end of the Revolutionary War? Hey, I had to ask Google when it was. I don't remember why. We don't celebrate that. What do we celebrate? We celebrate July 4th, 1776. Why is that? That's because that's the point in time that American leadership said, we are and ought to be, even though it had to be fought out. At the Passover, that's the point where the nation of Israel was really declared to belong to God. In fact, later on, we have the whole thing about having to redeem the firstborn. That's what's celebrated throughout the years. But what happened in the baptism, in the crossing of the Red Sea and its significance? Well, it prefigures baptism. Say, what? Really? Yep. How do I know that? Because the Apostle Paul said so. And if he said so, then that's what it is. Now, I've been reading, actually, I have read this marvelous commentary. Pete and Jackie gave me something from Dennis Prager, who's an excellent Jewish theologian. But there's so much of the richness that he misses because he just doesn't see what the New Testament says. What took place there at the birth of the nation prefigures what takes place with a human being who gives his heart and life to Christ. When we believe in God and in his salvation and his promises to us, there is a thing that happens in our heart, just as what was supposed to have happened at the Passover. Remember, they had to be circumcised to partake of it, and that's a covenant relationship. We enter into a relationship with God at the new birth, but then we have a thing called baptism, which is a physical thing. And somehow we go through the waters and we come back alive, whereas the Egyptians went through the water and they wound up dead. But the interesting thing is this. God took the entire nation of Israel through the Red Sea, through that baptism. Baptism symbolizes a new life. They are about to start a new life. No longer the slaves of Pharaoh, but they were supposed to be a people who were supposed to be holy for God. That's what that was supposed to take place. A nation that was supposed to be holy for Him, to serve Him. And when we're baptized, it's supposed to be an indication that we are a people, a person who wants to serve God and live a life of holiness. And then it says this, but with most of them, God was not pleased. Do you know how many people there are in our world? Maybe fewer in our world today, but it used to be this way. Who would say, well, I'm sure that when I die, I'm going to go to heaven. Why? Because I've been baptized. Okay. Was that some kind of a magic thing that took place for you? If you're baptized, live as though you have started a new life. Obviously, it doesn't mean you're going to have a change of job, necessarily. You're not suddenly not going to become a foot taller. You're not going to gain all kinds of talents you didn't have before. No. What you're simply saying is, I am declaring to myself and to those who care about me that I am now living for God and not for myself. The people of Israel who crossed with Moses never got it through their mind that what they were there for was to be a holy nation, to serve God. And they had a very particular task. Their task was to let the whole world know that there is one God who created everything and has told us how He wants us to live. That was their job, and they failed spectacularly at it. We don't want to fail spectacularly in the job that we've given, because the church has been handed the task of making people be aware of God's salvation. God always says, behold my salvation. He has the fix for everything. Now, I think it's important to make mention of the fact that those who do not believe the Bible to be God's Word look at this story and go, ha, you know, that's like a fairy tale. Didn't happen, couldn't have happened. How do you know it didn't happen? Well, because it couldn't happen. That kind of thing just doesn't happen. Well, no, it doesn't happen just that once. That's like saying the Big Bang, if that's what happened, didn't happen because we don't see it happening. Well, no, we can't see it happening. It happens once. The atonement, the resurrection, one-time events. So you can't say that something didn't happen just because it doesn't happen. On the other hand, there are those who say, well, listen, we have shovels. And when we dig around out there, we can't find any evidence. And we send divers down to the Red Sea and we don't find any old chariots. Give me a break. You know how long ago that was? And that's not deep water like the Titanic. The Titanic is in very deep water. Have you seen any recent pictures of the Titanic? Even though that's in very deep water where there's not much oxygen, it's pretty much corroding to nothing. So if you take something in warm, shallow water, relatively shallow, deep enough to drown an army, but the Red Sea is not that deep, you really expect anything to survive all these thousands of years? Just because you can find a clay pot in the desert someplace and say, well, this thing is 5,000 years old. I mean, they just found a clay pot with yeast in it and made bread with 5,000-year-old yeast. That's a wonderful thing. But basically, those who don't like to believe in God and His intervention in human history will just pass it off and say, we can't find any evidence. And if we can't find the evidence, then it didn't happen. However, they're then left to explain, well, where did the nation of Israel come from? You know, there's several thousands of years that we know about these people. And what's been fun to me is through the years, having people say, well, you know, we never found any evidence that there really was any King David. We think that King David, that just was a whole bunch of stories kind of like the stories of Robin Hood and King Arthur and all those. Not really a real person. We just kind of get all these legends and put them together, and that's what we have the story. That's what King David was. And then they find things that indicate that, oh no, there was a King David. So, but you know, years after they say this never happened, then they find the evidence it did. For years they used to laugh about Nineveh, saying Nineveh didn't exist. That's a made-up story about Jonah. Then they find out, oh yeah, Nineveh was a huge city, and Nineveh had some innovations. For example, they had radiant heat in the floors of their buildings. Pretty good. They had a fire down here, and the flue was the floor of their homes, made of clay, and it went up and they heated their homes that way. What I'm simply saying is, arrogant people like to think that if it's not part of their life experience, then it doesn't happen. Then no way. I've had to confess that my wife and I very often watch Judge Judy. And on a few occasions, the judge has said, that's nonsense. Nobody does that. I don't believe you. I looked at Tom and I said, we do that. We do that. I guess she wouldn't believe us. Her life experience is this. And she does. Every human judge makes some judgment upon their own understanding of humanity and life experience, but there are some parts of life experience that apparently she hasn't experienced, so she doesn't think that people necessarily behave the way we behave. I don't know if that's good or bad, but so you have this. And they say, we've searched up and down, and then they come up with different things. Well, you know, it must have happened, but here's what happened. There's this really shallow area at the Red Sea, and it's really not the Red Sea, it's a different sea, the Sea of Reeds, and the Bible just got the geography mixed up. And it's shallow enough that if the tide is right and the wind's blowing, you could probably cross. How would it be dry, though? And it was pointed out many years ago when some young kid heard about it, and the person was saying it really wasn't a miracle, it was just, you know, coincidental that they were there when these things happened. He said, well, then it was a miracle. He said, well, why? Well, if the water was that shallow, how did the whole army drown in it? That's a miracle. You know? There's no way they can get around it. The point is, this thing happened. We don't know all the details of it, but what we do know is that God fights for the people that He has chosen, and He fights against the people who oppose Him. We like to think that it doesn't work that way. That somehow the wicked are just always getting away with things, and David mentions, and other people mention, Lord, how long are you going to wait before you deal with the wicked? He waited a very long time before he dealt with Pharaoh. Pharaoh's policies caused more heartache and grief and sorrow among the nation of Israel than anyone until the days probably, well, I don't know. They've had their repetitions of it. You have Titus under the Romans. You have obviously had Hitler in the modern day. You had Saladin when the Muslims came into Jerusalem. You had all these people. You had under Judas Maccabeus, I forget the name of the Greek guy that caused them so much difficulty. Sorrow upon sorrow upon sorrow. And when that happens, we sometimes think, God isn't doing anything about it. But He is. And He has to prepare people. It took a great deal of work on God's part in terms of all the miracles, to take the descendants of Abraham and turn them into a large group of people that were cohesive, that recognized one another, and get them to start a new nation. I've read people say, well, why did God let them be slaves almost immediately after the death of Joseph? Why did he let them become slaves? Well, think about this. Their makeup, physically, was not that different from the Egyptians. We know this because people thought Moses was an Egyptian. They weren't that radically different. It wasn't like, oh, well, you're Scandinavian white and you're, deep African brown or black. It wasn't that way. And if they had been allowed to stay and prosper and be free people, what would have happened? They would have spread throughout the whole nation of Israel and beyond, and they would have never have made any kind of cohesive grouping. But because they were enslaved and isolated, they formed their own identifiable group. They knew who an Egyptian was. They knew who an Israeli was. And by allowing that to take place, God's strategy for humanity was fulfilled because he was able to birth a nation in a day. And that nation, whom he promised would survive forever, is still with us. You tell me, you name any other group of people who was around 5,000 years ago, that is, as a nation, that is still a nation today. Name one. There's one. Israel. Moscow? No, the Mongols were all over that place years before that, and then there were people before that. My grandfather's home country of Scotland. There have been so many different groups of people overrun that place. Well, I don't care where in Europe, I don't care where in Africa, where in South America. The people who were once there are gone. Nobody even knows where to find them. North America, it doesn't matter. Anywhere. One nation. Thinking about that time period 5,000 years ago, I read that they finally got a boat ready to sail the high seas. The Mayflower is about ready to go across the Atlantic, just 400 years after the first one did. Folks, we're looking at a country that's a baby 400 years ago, and yet that seems like ancient history to us. And the people who live today could care less, with a few exceptions, but the vast majority of Americans today could care less about what caused the pilgrims to do what they did, how they lived, what they believed. They could care less about it. And yet, 430 years after Abraham went down to Egypt, not Abraham, Joseph and Jacob, after they went down, 430 years later, their descendants come out, a new nation. And the leadership, starting with Moses, was dedicated to the promises that God had made. How do we know that? Because they took Joseph's bones in a coffin. They took Joseph's bones with them and eventually interred them in the grave that Abraham had purchased for Sarah. We need to look at the big sweep of history of what God is doing, because God was doing all this for one very specific reason. That not just the nation of Israel, but that the world would recognize when Jesus Christ came on the scene to fulfill all of God's plans. And we ought to be so confident. And a God who worked that way in history, to recognize that he continues to work in history and he will bring everything to pass just as he plans for it to do, and he will work in our lives. So like the psalmist says, though my heart and tongue fail, yet I will praise him. In my flesh, I shall see God. And that's what he wants. Our lives can have the wheels totally come off, and they often do. But we can believe that we have a God who made the ears and hears us, who made the eyes and sees us, but made the heart and feels us. And he cares. And he will do righteousness for us. Let's pray.